Okay, friends. Oh, happy day. We are back to finding out what is in the casket. I want to show you my shirt. I don't think I've worn this. It said, "The wilderness must be explored. Start at your library." The libraries are back open now, which is very exciting. You can get books that are on hold. And of course, all the electronic books are still available. So I have been very happy. We ended with the fact that uh, big things are happening. Ellen and Anne Marie and Kirsty and Ellen Marie and Kirsty's mom all went to their uncle's home, Uncle Henrik, who is a fisherman um, uh, by a sea that is right by Sweden, we learned. That may become important. We also know that Ellen separated from her parents because there was a lot of quick moving elements with the Nazis asking for the names and addresses of all of the people that lived in the synagogues, the Jewish people from the Jewish churches, and that made everyone kind of scramble. Ellen went to go to sleep at Anne Marie's house, excuse me, and the parents went somewhere else. When Ellen and Anne Marie and Kirsty and Anne Marie and Kirsty's mom went to Uncle Henrik's. They were enjoying the fact they were out in the country, kind of taking a moment away from soldiers. And Uncle Henrik says that there has been a death. Anne Marie does not quite believe that. She's never heard of Great Aunt Bertie. And he does admit to her that there is no Great Aunt Bertie, right? So when we left off, they were setting up the home for a viewing. And at this point, this is the 1940s, and this is Denmark. It is their custom to have the deceased in their home for a day or so as people come and pay their respects. So while that is happening, Peter, of all people, who was engaged to Anne Marie's sister Lisa, who passed away, um, brings Ellen's parents and brings them to Uncle Henrik's home. And that's kind of how it ended. And I'll reread just a tiny bit so that we can kind of feel that energy. And then we'll go right into Let Us Open the Casket. She could hear a sharp, low cry from Ellen, and then the sound of voices speaking softly. In a moment Uncle Henrik returned. Behind him was Peter Nielsen. Tonight Peter went first to Mamma and hugged her. Then he hugged Anne Marie and kissed her on the cheek. But he said nothing. There was no playfulness in his affection tonight, just a sense of urgency, of worry. He went immediately to the living room, looked around, and nodded at the silent people there. And remember, there were other people that came. There was an older man, there was a couple with a baby. Ellen was still outside, but in a moment the door opened and she returned, held tightly like a little girl, her bare legs dangling against her father's chest. Her mother was beside them. Chapter 10. Let us open the casket. We are all here now, Uncle Henrik said, looking around the living room. I must go. Anne Marie stood in the wide doorway, looking in from the hall. The baby slept now, and its mother looked tired. Her father sat beside her, his arm across her shoulders. The old man's head was still bent. Peter sat alone, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. It was clear that he was deep in thought. On the sofa, Ellen sat between her parents, one hand clasped tightly in her mother's. She looked up at Anne Marie but did not smile. Anne Marie felt a surge of sadness. The bond of their friendship had not broken, but it was as if Ellen had moved now into a different world, the world of her own family and whatever lay ahead for them. The elderly bearded man looked up suddenly as Uncle Henrik prepared to go. God keep you safe, he said in a firm but quiet voice. Henrik nodded. God keep us all safe, he replied. Then he turned and left the room. A moment later, Anne Marie heard him leave the house. Mamma brought the teapot from the kitchen and a tray of cups. Anne-Marie helped her pass the cups around. No one spoke. Anne-Marie, Mama whispered it to her in the hall. You might go to bed if you want to. It is very late. Anne-Marie shook her head, but she was tired. She could see that Ellen was too. Her friend's head was leaning on her mother's shoulder, and her eyes closed now and then. Finally, Anne-Marie went to the empty rocking chair in the corner of the living room and curled there with her head against its soft, padded back. She dozed. She was startled from her half-sleep by the sudden sweep of headlights through the sheer curtains across the room as a car pulled up outside. The car door slammed. Everyone in the room tensed, but no one spoke. She heard, as if in a recurring nightmare, the pounding on the door, and then the heavy, frightened, familiar staccato of boots on the kitchen floor. The woman with the baby gasped and began suddenly to weep, which obviously weep is crying. The male accented voice from the kitchen was loud. We have observed, he said, that an unusual number of people have gathered at this house tonight. What is the explanation? There has been a death, Mamma's voice replied calmly. It is our custom to gather and pay our respects when a family member dies. I am sure you are familiar with our customs. One of the officers pushed Mama ahead of him from the kitchen and entered the living room. There were others behind him. They filled the wide doorway. As always, their boots gleamed, their guns, their helmets. All of them gleamed in the candlelight. It's very scary, right? Anne-Marie watched as the man's eyes moved around the room. He looked for a long time at the casket, probably thinking what you and I are thinking. We're like, who's in there? What's going on? Then he moved his gaze, focusing on each person in turn. When his eyes reached her, she looked back at him steadily. Who died? He asked harshly. No one answered. They watched Anne-Marie, and she realized that the officer was directing the question at her. Now she knew for certain what Uncle Henrik had meant when he talked to her in the barn. To be brave came more easily if you knew nothing. So for her, she knows it's a lie, but she doesn't exactly know who is in the casket, and she's been told Great Aunt Bertie. So she's going to lie and hopefully have some, it's going to seem authentic or real because she doesn't know, so it won't look like she's lying. She swallowed. My great Aunt Bertie, she lied in a firm voice. The officer moved forward suddenly across the room to the casket. He placed one gloved hand on its lid. Poor great Aunt Bertie, he said in a condescending voice. So descend means go down. So you are looking down on the person. Poor great Aunt Bertie. There's no sincerity there. I do know your customs, he said, turning to gaze toward Mamma, who still stood in the doorway. And I know it is the custom to pay one's respects to your loved one in the face. It seems odd to me that you have closed this casket up so tightly. His hand was now a fist, and he rubbed it across the edge of the polished lid. Why is it not open? He demanded. Let us open it up and take one last look at great Aunt Bertie. Anne-Marie saw Peter across the room stiffen in his chair, lift his chin, and reach slowly with one hand toward his side. Not sure what that's about. Mamma walked quickly across the room, directly to the casket, directly to the officer. You're right, she said. The doctor said it should be closed because Aunt Bertie had died of typhus, and he said that there was a chance that the germs would still be there, which would be dangerous. But what does he know? Only a country doctor, and an old man at that. Surely typhus germs wouldn't linger in a dead person. And dear Aunt Bertie, I have been longing to see her face, to kiss her goodbye. Of course we will open the casket. I'm glad you suggested. With a swift motion, the Nazi officer slapped Mamma across the face. She staggered backward, and a white mark on her cheek darkened. You foolish woman, he spat. To think that we have any interest in seeing the body of your diseased aunt. Open it after we leave, he said. Now, if you were shocked there, that is shocking, right? Mama was slapped. Mama was just a little bit condescending herself, as she says, "Oh, of course, let's open it. Let's all have our germs." And that made him look a little bit like a fool, which is probably why he slapped her. Um, and still hasn't answered who or what is in the casket. But this is a moment of high tension. With one gloved thumb, he pressed a candle flame into darkness. The hot wax spattered the table. "Put all these candles out," he said, "or pull the curtains." Then he strode to the doorway and left the room. Motionless, silent, one hand to her cheek, Mama listened, they all listened, as the uniformed men left the house. In a moment they heard the car doors, the sound of its engine, and finally they heard it drive away. "Mama!" Aunt Marie cried. Her mother shook her head quickly and glanced at the open window covered only by a sheer curtain. So no screen, no central air like we might have. Anne Marie understood. There might still be soldiers outside, waiting and listening, even though it looked like they went away. Maybe one is right there. Peter stood, drew the dark curtains across the windows. He relit the extinguished candle. Then he reached for the old Bible that had always been there on the mantel. He opened it quickly and said, "I will read a psalm," which is a prayer. His eyes turned to the page that he had opened at random, and he began to read in a strong voice. "Oh, praise the Lord! How good it is to sing psalms to our God! How pleasant to praise him! The Lord is rebuilding Jerusalem. He gathers in the scattered sons of Israel. It is he who heals the broken in spirit and binds up their wounds. He who numbers the stars one by one." So that's obviously a reference to our title, Number the Stars. And that's from the Bible, saying God numbers those stars one by one. There's a reason for each and every star. Mama sat down and listened. Gradually, they all began to relax. Anne Marie could see the old man across the room, moving his lips as Peter read. He knew the ancient psalm by heart. Anne Marie didn't. The words were unfamiliar to her, and she tried to listen, tried to understand, tried to forget the war and the Nazis, tried not to cry, tried to be brave. And that's called parallelism, when you do the same word or phrase over and over and tie it a little differently. They're not the same, but they are similar, kind of like parallel lines moving in the same direction. The night breeze moved the dark curtains at the open windows. Outside, she knew, the sky was speckled with stars. How could anyone number them one by one, as the psalm said? There were too many, and the sky was too big. Ellen had said that her mother was afraid of the ocean, that it was too cold and too big. The sky was, too, thought Anne Marie. The whole world was too cold and too big and too cruel. Peter read on in his firm voice, though it was clear he was tired. The long minutes passed. They seemed hours. Finally, still reading, he moved quietly to the window. He closed the Bible and listened to the quiet night. Then he looked around the room. "Now," he said, "it is time." First he closed the windows. Then he went to the casket and opened the lid. Yes, we will read on. Chapter 11. "Will we see you again soon, Peter?" Anne Marie blinked. Across the dark room, she saw Ellen, too, peering into the narrow wooden box in surprise. There was no one in the casket at all. Instead, it seemed to be stuffed with folded blankets and articles of clothing. Peter began to lift the things out and distribute them to the silent people in the room. He handed heavy coats to the man and the woman, and another to the old man with the beard. "It will be very cold," he murmured. "Put them on." He found a thick sweater for Mrs. Rosen and a woolen jacket for Ellen's father. After a moment of rummaging through the folded things, he found a smaller winter jacket and handed it to Ellen. Anne Marie watched as Ellen took the jacket in her arms and looked at it. It was patched and worn. It was true that there had been few new clothes for anyone during the recent years, but still Ellen's mother had always managed to make clothes for her daughter. often using old things that she was able to take apart and refashion in a way that made them seem brand new. Never had Ellen worn anything so shabby and old. But she put it on, pulled it around her, and buttoned the mismatched buttons. Peter, his arms full of the odd pieces of clothing, looked toward the silent couple with the infant. "I'm sorry," he said. "There's nothing for a baby." "I'll find something," Mamma said quickly. "The baby must be warm." She left the room and was back in a moment with Kirsty's thick red sweater. "Here," she said softly to the mother. "It will be much too big, but that will make it even warmer for him." The woman spoke for the first time. "Her," she whispered. "She's a girl. Her name is Rachel." Mamma smiled and helped her direct the sleeping baby's arms into the sleeves of the sweater. Together they buttoned the heart-shaped buttons. How Kirsty loved that sweater with its heart buttons, until the tiny child was completely encased in the warm red wool. Her eyelids fluttered, but she did not wake. Peter reached into his pocket and took something out. He went to the parents and leaned down toward the baby. He opened the lid of a small bottle in his hand. "How much does she weigh?" Peter asked. "Well, she was 7 pounds when she was born," the young woman replied. "She's gained a little, but not much. Maybe 8 pounds now, no more." "A few drops will be enough then. It has no taste. She won't even notice." The mother tightened her arms around the baby and looked up at Peter, pleading. "Please, no," she said. "She sleeps all night. Please. She doesn't need it, I promise. She won't cry." Peter's voice was firm. "We can't take the chance." So in that medicine, usually I ask kids, "What do you think that is?" And most of them can come up with it's some kind of sleeping medicine. And then I say, "Well, why would the mother be resistant to that?" And they're only guessing what it weighs. She's not sure. As the mother, you're not sure if there'll be a reaction to the medication, if it's too much medication. Um, it's dangerous to give medication to very, very small infants, newborns, and there has to be a sense of worry there as you give your baby sleeping medication. But clearly, they're going somewhere where they need to be very quiet. I'm going to pause for just a second. Guys, you might want to handle the cats and put them away, just since there's stuff on the counters. All right, I'm back. "Please, she won't cry." Peter's voice was firm. "We can't take a chance," he said. He inserted the dropper of the bottle into the baby's tiny mouth and squeezed a few drops of liquid onto her tongue. The baby yawned and swallowed. The mother closed her eyes. Her husband gripped her shoulder. Next, Peter removed the folded blankets from the coffin one by one and handed them around. "Carry these with you," he said. "You will need them later for warmth." Anne Marie's mother moved around the room and gave each person a small package of food. The cheese and bread and apples that Anne Marie had helped her prepare in the kitchen hours before. So they made all this food as though it was a viewing or a funeral, and really it was for them on their journey. Finally, Peter took a paper-wrapped packet from the inside of his own jacket. He looked around the room at the assembled people now dressed in bulky winter clothing and motioned to Mr. Rosen, who followed him to the hall. Anne Marie could overhear their conversation. "Mr. Rosen," Peter said, "I must get this to Henrik, but I might not see him. I am going to take the others only to the harbor, and they will go to the boat alone. I want you to deliver this. Without fail, it is of great importance." There was a moment of silence in the hall, and Anne Marie knew that Peter must be giving the packet to Mr. Rosen's. That's Ellen's father. Anne Marie could see it protruding or coming, bulky, a little bit out from Mr. Rosen's pocket when he returned to the room and sat down again. She could see, too, that Mr. Rosen had a puzzled look. He didn't know what the packet contained, and he hadn't asked. So I think that goes back to sometimes it's better not to know. I know particularly little children like Kirsty are very curious, and that's a wonderful thing. Curiosity is wonderful, but there are times to ask less questions because, as Uncle Henrik said, sometimes it's better not to know. It can make you be braver sometimes, and sometimes it is difficult to know the truth, and it's better not to know everything all at once. Now, Peter said, looking at his watch, I will lead the first group, you and you and you. He gestured to the old man and the young people with their baby. Inga, he said. Anne-Marie realized that it was the first time he had called Peter Nielsen. She had heard Peter Nielsen call her mother by her first name. Before, it had always been Mrs. Johansson. Or, in the old days, during the merriment and excitement of his engagement to Lisa, it had been occasionally Mama. Now it was Inga. It was as if he had moved beyond his own youth and he had taken a place in the world of adults. Her mother nodded and waited for his instructions. You wait 20 minutes and then bring the Rosens. Don't come sooner. We must be separate on the path so there is less of a chance of being seen. Mrs. Johansson nodded. Come directly back to the house after you have seen the Rosens safely to Henrik. Stay in the shadows and on the back path. You know that, of course. By the time you get to the Rosens to the boat, Peter went on, I will be gone. As soon as I deliver my group, I must move on. There is other work to be done tonight. He turned to Anne-Marie, so I will say goodbye to you now. Anne-Marie went to him and gave him a hug. But will we see you again soon? She asked. I hope so, Peter said, very soon. Don't grow much more, or you'll be taller than I am, little Longlegs. Anne-Marie smiled, but Peter's comment was no longer the light-hearted fun of the past. It was only a brief grasp at something that had gone. Peter kissed Mamma wordlessly. Then he wished the Rosens Godspeed and led the others through the door. So he's taking the older man and the couple with the baby to the boat, which we're assuming Uncle Henrik's on. We are assuming Uncle Henrik is going to take them to safety. And the best we could possibly know is Sweden, I would think, because that's not a place where the Nazi soldiers are. Mamma, Anne-Marie, and the Rosens sat in silence. There was a slight commotion outside, and Mamma went quickly to look. In a moment she was back. It's all right, she said in response to their looks. The old man stumbled, but Peter helped him up. He didn't seem to be hurt. Well, maybe just his pride, she added, smiling a bit. What an odd word, pride. Anne-Marie looked at the Rosens sitting there wearing their misshapen, ill-fitting clothing, holding ragged blankets folded in their arms, their faces drawn and tired. She remembered the earlier, happier times. Mrs. Rosen, her hair neatly combed and covered, lighting the Sabbath candles and saying the ancient prayer. And Mr. Rosen, sitting in the big chair in their living room, studying his thick books, correcting papers, adjusting his glasses, looking up now and then to complain good-naturedly about the lack of decent light. She remembered Ellen in her school play, moving confidently across the stage, her gestures sure, her voices clear. All of those things, those sources of pride, the candlesticks, the books, the daydreams of theater, had been left behind in Copenhagen. They had nothing with them now. There was only the clothing of unknown people for warmth, the food from Henrik's farm for survival, and the dark path ahead through the woods to freedom. Anne-Marie realized, though she had not really been told, that Uncle Henrik was going to take them in his boat across the sea to Sweden, which is what I had said earlier. She knew how frightened Mrs. Rosen was of the sea, its width, its depth, its cold. She knew how frightened Ellen was of the soldiers, with their guns and boots, who were certainly looking for them. And she knew how frightened they all must be of the future. But their shoulders were as straight as they had been in the past, in the classroom, on the stage, at the Sabbath table. So there were other sources too of pride, and they had not left everything behind. So pride goes along with being proud, things that you're proud of. So obviously they're proud of their books, their religion, the things they do at school, and here they have nothing. And she said she still sees a sense of pride in them because it's also a pride in your character and in who you are. And even if those things are taken from you, your physical things, they still have their belief in themselves, their love for one another with them. That cannot be taken away. Chapter 12. Where was Mama? Mr. Rosen tripped on the loose step outside the kitchen door. So it was the older man tripped on that loose step, and now Mr. Rosen trips on the loose step. His wife grasped his arm, and he regained his balance. It's very dark, Mama whispered, as they stood in the yard with their blankets and bundles of food gathered in their arms. We can't use any kind of light. I will go first. I know the way very well, and you follow me. Try not to stumble over the tree roots in the path. Feel carefully with your feet. The path is uneven. Be very, very quiet, she added, unnecessarily, meaning they all know that they need to be quiet, but she just needs to stress it because it is so important. The night was quiet too. A slight breeze moved in the tops of the trees, and from across the meadow came the sound of the sea's movement, which was a constant sound here, and had always been. But no birds called or cried here now in the night. The cow slept silently in the barn, the kitten upstairs in Kirsty's arms. There were stars here and there dotting the sky among the thin clouds, but no moon. Anne Marie shivered, standing at the foot of the steps. Come, Mamma murmured, and she moved away from the house. One by one, the Rosens turned and hugged Anne Marie silently. Ellen came to her last. The two girls held each other. I'll come back some day, Ellen whispered fiercely. I promise. I know you will, Anne Marie whispered back, holding her friend tightly. Then they were gone, Mamma and the Rosens. Anne Marie was alone. She went into the house, crying suddenly, and closed the door against the night. So clearly, just Mama is now taking the second set of people, which is Ellen and her parents, to the harbor. The lid of the casket was closed again, but the room was empty. There was no sign of the people who had sat there for those hours. Anne Marie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She opened the dark curtains in the windows. She curled once more in the rocker, trying to relax, and traced their route in her mind. She knew the old path, too, not as well as her mother, who had followed it almost every day of her childhood, with her dog scampering behind. But Anne Marie had often walked to town and back that way, and she remembered the twists, the turns, the trees whose gnarled roots pushed the earth now and then into knotted clumps, and the thick bushes that often flowered in early summer. She walked with them in her mind, feeling the way through the darkness. It would take them, she thought, half an hour to reach the place where Uncle Henrik was waiting with his boat. Mamma would leave them there, pausing a moment, no more, for a final hug, and then she would turn and come home. It would be faster for Mamma alone, with no need to wait as the Rosens, unfamiliar with the path, slowly felt their way along. Mamma would hurry, sure-footed now, back to her children. The clock in the hall struck once. It was 2:30 in the morning. Her mother would be home in an hour, Anne Marie decided. She rocked gently back and forth in the old chair. Mamma would be home by 3:30. She thought of Papa back in Copenhagen alone. He would be awake too. He would be wishing he could have come, but knowing that he must come and go as always, to the corner store for the newspaper, to his office when morning came. Now he would be afraid for them, watching the clock, waiting for word that the Rosens were safe, that Mamma and the girls were here at the farm, starting a new day with the sun shining through the kitchen window and cream on their oatmeal. It was harder for the ones who were waiting, Anne Marie thought. Less danger, perhaps, but more fear. I love that line. So she's not doing the actual brave act of taking them, but she's the one waiting. So she said, it's harder for the ones who are waiting, Anne Marie knew. Less danger, perhaps, but more fear, more time to actually sit and be fearful for them. She yawned and her head nodded. She fell asleep, and it was a sleep as thin as the night clouds, dotted with dreams that came and went like the stars. A lot of reference to stars, right? Because of Number of the Stars. Light woke her. It was not really morning, not yet. It was only the first hint of a slightly lightening sky, a pale gleam at the edge of the meadow, a sign that far away somewhere to the east, where Sweden still slept, morning would be coming soon. Dawn would creep across the Swedish farmland and coast, and then it would wash little Denmark with light and move across the North Sea to wake Norway. Anne Marie blinked in confusion, sitting up, remembering after a moment where she was and why. But that it was not right. The pale light at the horizon, it should be dark still. It should still be night. She stood stiffly, stretching her legs, and went to the hall to look at the old clock. It was past 4. Where was Mamma? Perhaps she had come home, not wanting to wake Anne Marie, and had gone to bed herself. Surely that was it. Mamma must have been exhausted. She had been up all night, had made the dangerous journey to the boat, returned through the dark woods, wanting only to sleep. Quickly, Anne Marie went to the narrow staircase. The door to the bedroom where she had slept with Ellen was open. The 2 small beds were neatly made, covered with old quilts, and empty. Beside it, Uncle Henrik's door was open too, and his bed, too, was unused and empty. Despite her worry, Anne Marie smiled slightly when she saw some of Henrik's clothes crumpled in a chair and a pair of shoes, caked with barnyard dirt, lying on the floor. He needs a wife, she said to herself, imitating Mamma. The door to the other bedroom, the one Kirsty and Mamma were sharing, was closed. Quietly, not wanting to wake them, Anne Marie pushed it open, hoping Mamma is there sleeping with Kirsty. The kitten's ears moved, standing up straight. Its eyes opened wide, and it raised its head and yawned. It pried itself out of Kirsty's arms, stretched, and then jumped lightly to the floor and came to Anne Marie. It rubbed itself against her leg and purred. Kirsty sighed and turned in her sleep. One arm, free now of the kitten's warmth and comfort, flung itself across the pillow. There was no one else in the wide bed. So it's just Kirsty. Mama is not there. So something must be terribly wrong. She had set it in her mind that Mama would be home by 3:30, and it's 4. Anne Marie moved quickly to the window, which overlooked the clearing that led to the path's entrance. The light outside was still very dim. She peered through the dimness, trying to see, looking for the opening in the trees where the path began, looking for Mama hurrying home. After a second she saw a shape there, something unfamiliar, something that had not been there the day before. A dark shape, no more than a blurred heap at the beginning of the path. Anne Marie squinted, forcing her eyes to understand, needing to understand, not wanting to understand. The shape moved, and she knew. It was her mother, lying on the earth. Oh, so I suppose if there's some good news, Mama is moving. The shape moved, and she's made it to home. But something is terribly wrong if she's lying on the earth and she's late. So that's the end of the chapter. The next chapter, chapter 13, is called Run as Fast as You Can. So that sounds like very suspenseful, like something is still going wrong. I'm not sure if it's because Mama's hurt or what is the issue, but I promise that I will read the next few chapters. I'm thinking Wednesday. Today's Sunday, so I'll post this Sunday and then Wednesday, and we'll make sure that I have a special guest. You know, my special guest for the next chapters with Run, since the special guest likes to run around and be crazy. Okay, I hope you're reading a wonderful book. I hope your summer is going great, and I will see you Wednesday when I post the next one. All right, love you guys. Bye bye.